Number 1, Ivar the Boneless. In the year 866, a massive Scandinavian invasion force descended on the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. Their target was the city of Eoforwich, what we now call York. The timing was deliberate. Northumbria was tearing itself apart in a civil war between two rival kings, Osbert and Ella. The Vikings didn't just exploit this fracture, they annihilated both sides of it. Osbert and Ella were each captured and executed, and the man who orchestrated all of it may not have been able to walk. His name was Ivar Ragnarsson. History remembers him as Ivar the Boneless. The epithet has generated centuries of medical speculation. The most widely discussed theory, proposed by several modern scholars, is that Ivar suffered from osteogenesis imperfecta, a genetic condition commonly known as brittle bone disease. It causes fragile bones, and in severe cases, near total physical immobility. Multiple saga sources describe Ivar being carried into battle on a shield or litter. If the diagnosis is correct, that image becomes less symbolic and more literal. A man whose skeleton could shatter from a fall was commanding the largest Viking army ever assembled. That army is known as the Great Heathen Army. What made it exceptional was not just its size, but its composition. Ivar coordinated disparate warbands from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden into a single operational force. In modern military terms, this was a multinational coalition campaign. No Viking leader before him had achieved that level of logistical integration. Historian Claire Downham has argued that Ivar Ragnarsson and the figure known as Imar in Irish sources are the same person. If she is correct, his operational theater stretched from eastern England to the Irish Sea. The most infamous act attributed to Ivar is the Blood Eagle, supposedly performed on King Ella. The procedure, as described in the sagas, involved the dorsal separation of the ribs from the spine. The ribs were then bent outward to resemble wings, the lungs were pulled through the opening. Whether this actually happened is one of the most contested questions in Viking studies, and we will examine it in detail later. Ivar's military innovations went beyond brute force. He pioneered what might be called asymmetric mobility. His forces used the portage method, physically dragging longships overland on wooden rollers to bypass coastal defenses and strike deep inland. No other European military force of the period could do this. He also deployed traveling skalds as intelligence operatives. These were poets and storytellers who moved freely between Saxon courts, mapping political fractures and identifying weak points. Think of them as deep cover spies disguised as entertainers. But Ivar was not just a conqueror. He was an economist of violence. He established the Kingdom of Dublin as a hub for the international slave trade. Captured Anglo-Saxons, Irish, and Britons were funneled through Dublin's markets and sold as far east as the Abbasid Caliphate. The Danegeld, a national-scale protection racket in which entire kingdoms paid silver to avoid further raids, was a system Ivar helped pioneer. In 870, he besieged Dumbarton Rock, the fortress of the Britons of Strathclyde, starving the defenders for 4 months before looting the site with a fleet of 200 ships. His tactics included what some modern analysts have termed the hinterland strategy. This involved systematic crop destruction across wide areas. The goal was not just to defeat an army, it was to induce famine so severe that surviving populations had no choice but to sell themselves into slavery. He targeted monasteries during holy feast days to maximize psychological trauma. He replaced defeated Saxon nobles with puppet kings who served as buffer zones for future raids. The mainstream scholarly position holds that Ivar was a real historical commander with a genuine mobility impairment who compensated through tactical brilliance. The archaeological evidence from the Repton mass grave, excavated in 1982, revealed at least 249 bodies consistent with a large military force, possibly the Great Heathen Army itself, though Ivar's individual remains have never been confirmed. A fringe theory suggests that Ivar was not a single person at all, but a mythologized composite, and that boneless referred to supernatural flexibility or even sexual impotence rather than a medical condition. What we know of Ivar comes from 3 independent source traditions: the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Irish Annals, and later Norse sagas. None are fully reliable. Victorian-era historians further muddied the picture by downplaying Viking atrocities to romanticize Anglo-Saxon resistance. But Ivar's impact is physically measurable. The Danelaw, the region of England governed by Norse law, permanently altered the ethnic, linguistic, and legal landscape. Place names ending in -by and -thorpe still mark the settlements his army established. if Genghis Khan used terror instrumentally as a tool to force surrender and build an empire, the sources suggest Ivar's cruelty served a more personal function. That distinction matters, and the next man on this list makes a similar case from an entirely different angle. Number 2, Erik Bloodaxe. The name itself is the first piece of evidence. Bloodaxe does not refer to generic battlefield prowess. It refers specifically to the blood of kin on his weapon. Erik Haraldsson murdered at least 5 of his own brothers, Bjorn, Olaf, Sigtrygg, Frode, and Thorgils. In a culture that valued family bonds as the foundation of political legitimacy, kinslaying was the ultimate taboo. Erik made it his governing philosophy. He held the throne of Northumbria, again York, twice. Each reign was defined by violent purges of local opposition. He abolished the Thing, the traditional Viking democratic assembly, and replaced it with absolute military decree. This was a radical departure from Norse political culture. His wife, Gunhild, was rumored to be a sorceress. Their joint administration was feared for what chroniclers called its unnatural efficiency in eliminating rivals. After being exiled from Norway for excessive cruelty, a remarkable threshold to cross among 10th century Scandinavians, Erik transitioned to large-scale piracy in the Hebrides and Orkney Islands. He used these island chains as staging areas for terror raids across the North Sea. Back in York, he imposed a scat tax so heavy it bankrupted the northern English earls who had initially invited him to rule. His Huskarl shock troops were heavy infantry who specialized in decapitation strikes using the Dane axe. He physically separated himself from his own subjects by reviving Roman walls in York to create an isolated royal quarter. He suppressed critical skalds. Unlike most Viking leaders who celebrated poets and used their verses as a form of political advertising, Erik punished anyone who versified his brutality. He remained a committed pagan in an era of rapid Christianization, using the wolf warrior image as a deliberate brand of intimidation. He was so diplomatically toxic that no other Norse king would form an alliance with him. The mainstream view holds that Erik was a historical king of Norway and York whose cruelty led to exile and eventual death. The sole surviving material proof of his statehood is a handful of coins minted in York bearing his name. Without those coins, his entire kingship might be questioned. A fringe theory suggests that Erik Bloodaxe may actually conflate 2 or more separate rulers whose stories merged over time. His end came at the Battle of Stainmore in 954. He was reportedly betrayed by his own officers on a desolate moorland in the Pennines. The battlefield has never been located. Metal detectorists and landscape archaeologists continue to search for it. His sons, the Eirikssons, carried the fratricidal tradition into the next generation, plunging Norway back into civil war. Erik's York represents a lost historical possibility, a Viking urban state in England that might have rivaled Dublin had it not been consumed by its own ruler's paranoia. Genghis Khan executed men who betrayed their own lords, viewing loyalty as sacred. Erik's entire career was built on betraying his own blood. But there was another Viking leader who pursued a different kind of conversion, not of loyalty but of faith. And his methods were arguably worse. Number 3, Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf's doctrine was simple: accept baptism or die. He is the man most responsible for the forced Christianization of Norway, and his methods represent a case study in state-sponsored religious terror wrapped in divine mandate. The torture of Raud the Strong is one of the most specific accounts in Norse literature. A horn was forced into Raud's throat. A live snake was driven through it using a heated iron rod. Pagan sorcerers, practitioners of the Norse magical tradition known as Sider, were tied to rocks at low tide and forced to watch the water rise over hours. In the largest single massacre of the Christianization campaign, 80 male satyr practitioners were burned alive in a feasting hall. Before becoming Norway's king, Olaf had fought as a mercenary for the Kievan Rus and raided the Baltic. He served among the Varangians in the Byzantine Empire, where he likely witnessed how emperors used religious authority to consolidate power. 3 scholarly theories frame his career. The mainstream position is that Olaf was a genuine convert who used extreme methods that were, by medieval standards, not unusual for Christianization campaigns. Archaeological evidence is thinner. Church foundations in Trondheim may date to his reign, but confirmation is elusive. A fringe interpretation suggests Olaf's reported miracles, including healing the sick and surviving impossible odds, were borrowed from Byzantine imperial propaganda. His sainthood may have been a calculated personality cult. Olaf commissioned the Ormen Lange, or Long Serpent, reportedly the most advanced warship of the 10th century. It was said to be 45 meters long with 34 rowing benches per side. He replaced hereditary earls with appointed officials called lendermen, loyal only to him, dismantling Norway's traditional power structure. He established a church tithe that functioned as a military tribute, funding his wars through the very institution he claimed to serve. He slapped the Swedish Queen Sigrid the Haughty across the face for refusing to convert. That incident triggered a regional war that would eventually destroy him. At the Battle of Svolder, around 999 or 1000, Olaf was ambushed by a coalition of Danes, Swedes, and Norwegian rebels. Rather than surrender, he jumped overboard in full mail armor. His body was never recovered. The contrast with Genghis Khan is stark. Genghis practiced religious pluralism. He exempted clergy of all faiths from taxation. Olaf viewed religious difference as a capital offense. And his legacy carries a paradox the sagas never resolve. The church venerates him as a saint, while Icelandic literary tradition remembers him as a butcher. That tension between holiness and horror will surface again when we examine the next figure on this list, who operated in a setting no European had ever reached before. Number 4. Freydis Eiriksdottir. Around the year 1004, a Norse expedition sailed from Greenland to a place they called Vinland. Today we know it as Newfoundland, Canada. The expedition was driven by resource desperation. Greenland had been deforested. Timber and wild grapes, unavailable in the Arctic, were survival commodities. Freydis Eiriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, was among the leaders. What happened next constitutes what some historians have called the first European colonial atrocity in the Americas, a full millennium before Columbus. Freydis negotiated a 50-50 resource split with two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi. She then secretly stole their larger ship. When the arrangement collapsed, she orchestrated the murder of the brothers' entire crew, approximately 30 people, while they slept. When her male companions refused to kill the 5 women among the victims, Freydis took up an axe and did it herself. This is the only recorded instance in the saga literature of a woman performing mass execution. The mainstream scholarly view treats Freydis as a historical figure whose crimes are preserved in the saga of the Greenlanders as a cautionary tale. The archaeological site at Lons o Meadows, discovered in 1960 by Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad, and now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, confirms Norse presence in Newfoundland. But it cannot be tied to Freydis specifically. A fringe interpretation argues her story was exaggerated or invented by Christian-era saga writers to demonize pagan women and justify patriarchal social structures. What makes Freydis distinct is her methodology. She used gaslighting as a strategic tool. She told her husband Thorvard that the brothers had physically abused her, manipulating him into supporting the murders. She then threatened to kill any crew member who reported the massacre back in Greenland. Her goal was resource monopolization, to become the sole supplier of American timber to wood-starved Greenland. She operated in a legal vacuum. The Vinland frontier had no thing, no law code, no enforcement mechanism. Violence was the default form of dispute resolution. Genghis Khan prioritized the tribe and collective survival. Freydis prioritized herself at the direct expense of her community. Her betrayal contributed to the instability of the Greenland settlements by destroying the inter-community trust necessary for survival in a marginal Arctic environment. The Greenland colony went extinct by the 15th century. Freydis' crimes are one small chapter in that larger story of isolation, climate change, and social collapse. She lived out her final years in wealth but isolation, as her crimes eventually became public knowledge. The sagas label her the anti-shield maiden, a woman who wielded violence not for glory but for profit. And that combination of artistry and violence takes a very different form in the next figure, a man who could compose world-class poetry and rip out a throat in the same afternoon. Number 5, Egill Skallagrímsson. He committed his first killing at the age of 7. During a dispute over a ball game, he axed another boy to death. His mother's recorded response was to praise him as a good Viking material. Egill was likely afflicted with Paget's disease, a bone condition that produces abnormal thickening of the skull and distorted facial features. When his remains were reportedly exhumed centuries later, the skull withstood a full axe blow without cracking. In 2005, a skull found at the Mosfell church site in Iceland showed signs consistent with Paget's disease. It may be his. The paradox of Egill is that he was simultaneously Iceland's greatest poet and one of its most prolific killers. At the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, he fought as a mercenary for English King Athelstan. His berserker episodes were deployed as deliberate tactical weapons. During a formal duel, a holmgang, he bit through his opponent's windpipe to win, violating every established convention of ritualized combat. He created the nithing pole, a horse's head mounted on a stake and inscribed with a supernatural curse against the entire Norwegian royal family. In Norse culture, this was one of the most feared magical acts a person could perform. He manipulated the Icelandic Althing, the world's oldest parliament, to legally seize property from the families of men he had killed. He murdered the slaves who helped him bury his silver hoard so that the location would die with him. 3 theories frame Egill's historical existence. The mainstream position holds that he was a real Icelandic chieftain poet whose saga, written around 1230, preserves genuine 10th century verse. The archaeological evidence from Mosfell is suggestive but not conclusive. A fringe view argues the saga is largely fictional, a literary creation by Snorri Sturluson, exploring the archetype of the violent artist. His most famous composition is the Head Ransom poem. Captured by his arch-enemy Eric Bloodaxe in York, Egill composed a poem so technically masterful that Viking honor codes compelled the king to spare his life. That poem established a principle. A poet's words had measurable, transactional value. His elegy, the Sonatarek, written for his dead sons, is considered one of the most beautiful works in Old Norse literature. He composed it while simultaneously plotting a revenge massacre. Modern psychologists who have examined the saga accounts have retroactively suggested bipolar disorder, periods of deep depression alternating with episodes of hyper-violent mania. He sold his mercenary services to Saxons, Franks, and Rus indiscriminately. Loyalty was determined solely by silver. He fought in over 50 duels and battles and survived into his 80s, an extraordinary anomaly in an era when violent death was the professional standard. His final recorded act was an attempt to throw his buried gold into a crowd at the Althing, just to watch people kill each other for it. He died before he could carry it out. Genghis Khan was a disciplined commander who punished unauthorized violence. Egill was a volatile agent of chaos who killed over perceived insults at feasts. But raw chaos, however dangerous, rarely changes the map. The next figure combined Egill's capacity for violence with a geopolitical ambition that spanned from Constantinople to the coast of England. Number 6, Harald Hardrada. Harald Sigurdsson earned the epithet Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, through decades of unrelenting military expansion across 3 continents. His career began in the Varangian Guard, the elite Scandinavian mercenary unit that served the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. He rose to command. In 1042, during a political uprising, Harald personally gouged out the eyes of Byzantine Emperor Michael V. During a campaign in Sicily, he deployed a technique known as the Firebird. His men captured birds nesting inside a fortified city, tied burning tinder to their legs, and released them. The birds flew back to their nests. The city burned from within. He returned from Byzantium with enough gold to destabilize the entire Scandinavian economy. In modern terms, he imported inflation. Back in Norway, he executed any farmer who protested his taxes. He burned Hedeby, the wealthiest trade city in Scandinavia located in modern northern Germany, to settle a personal grudge with the Danish king. Archaeological excavations at Hedeby confirm a massive destruction layer consistent with the saga accounts. The mainstream scholarly view holds that Harald was a well-documented historical king. Byzantine and Norse sources both corroborate his career. The archaeological evidence at Hedeby supports the saga narratives. A fringe theory argues that his Byzantine exploits were inflated by court poets to legitimize his Norwegian kingship, and that his specific role in Emperor Michael's blinding may have been exaggerated. Harald instituted the Lidang, a naval conscription system that transformed Viking warfare from freelance piracy into organized state operations. He was described as 5 ells tall, roughly 6 feet 6 inches to 7 feet, making him a physically terrifying battlefield presence. He was the first Viking leader to deploy heavy Byzantine-style siege engines in northern Europe. He composed poetry on the battlefield, designing verses to simultaneously demoralize enemies and record his own legend. His invasion of England in 1066 was the final great Viking military campaign. He claimed the English throne through a tenuous legal loophole based on an alleged promise from Harthacnut. He brought approximately 300 ships and between 9,000 and 11,000 warriors. At the Battle of Fulford on September 20th, 1066, he decimated the northern English Earls Morcar and Edwin using a classic pincer maneuver. 5 days later, at Stamford Bridge, overconfidence killed him. Caught without his mail armor on a warm day, he took an arrow to the throat. His death on September 25, 1066, is the conventional closing date of the Viking Age. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror landed at Hastings and the medieval world shifted on its axis. Genghis Khan built the Silk Road infrastructure. Harald burned the trade hubs of the North Sea. He was the last man who genuinely believed he could build an empire stretching from Byzantium to England. His failure ended 3 centuries of Norse expansion. But while Harald fought for territory, the next figure on this list fought for something colder. Money. Number 7. Svein Forkbeard. Svein Haraldsson almost certainly ordered the death of his own father, Harald Bluetooth, the king who had unified Denmark and introduced Christianity. That act of patricide was the foundation of a career built on systematic economic warfare. In 1002, the English king Ethelred ordered the St. Brice's Day Massacre, a coordinated killing of Danes living in England. Among the dead was Svein's sister, Gunhild. The vengeance campaign that followed was not a series of raids. It was a calculated multi-year program designed to bankrupt the English state. Svein extorted 48,000 pounds of silver in a single Donegeld payment, the largest ransom in early medieval history. His invasions targeted England's productive capacity. He sacked the suburbs of London repeatedly, burning outer districts to force the king into hiding without committing to a costly siege. The mainstream academic view frames Svein as a pragmatic empire builder whose methods followed coherent strategic logic. The archaeological evidence is striking. The Trelleborg ring force, discovered in Denmark, are geometrically precise circular fortifications with barracked housing. They confirm the existence of a professional standing army, not a raiding warband. In terms of military engineering, these forts suggest Roman-level organizational capacity. A fringe theory holds that the Danegeld figures in Anglo-Saxon sources were inflated by English chroniclers to justify their king's failures. Svein was one of the few Viking leaders to utilize horses for rapid response warfare, breaking the stereotype of exclusively ship-borne raiders. He placed Danish sleeper agents in English towns to open gates during invasions. He established a central mint to convert looted English silver into standardized currency. His scorched earth policy dictated that any town refusing to pay would see every farm within a 50-mile radius burned. He routinely took the children of English nobles as hostages and mutilated them if payments were late. He became the first Viking king of England in 1013, effectively dismantling the Saxon state. He died 5 weeks later. The legend says he was killed by the ghost of Saint Edmund, the very king Ivar the Boneless had martyred a century before. Genghis Khan's Yasa law code protected the poor and regulated commerce. Svein's system was purely a tax-harvesting machine, but he paved the way for his son Knut's North Sea Empire, the largest political entity in northern Europe since the Roman withdrawal. Unlike Svein, who operated with strategic precision, the next Viking on this list made his reputation through a campaign of spectacular miscalculation. Number 8. Bjorn Ironside. In 859, Bjorn Ironside led a fleet of 62 ships past the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. It was one of the most audacious naval expeditions of the entire Viking Age. His target was Rome. He attacked a city called Luna, massacred its population, and only later discovered it was not Rome. The infiltration method has become one of the most famous anecdotes in saga literature. Bjorn pretended to be a dying Viking who wished to receive Christian baptism. He was carried into the city in a coffin. Once inside the church, he leapt from the casket and killed the priest who had blessed him. The expedition ranged across the western Mediterranean. Bjorn raided the coast of North Africa, capturing Tuareg people, referred to as blue men in Norse sources for Scandinavian slave markets. He pillaged the Balearic Islands, establishing a temporary piracy base on Majorca. He sailed up the Rhone River deep into France, reaching the city of Valence to sack inland monasteries far from any coastal defense. He lost 40 of his 62 ships to a Moorish naval ambush involving incendiary weapons similar to Greek fire, but continued the expedition with the survivors. The mainstream position treats Bjorn as a historical raider whose Mediterranean campaign is corroborated by both Frankish and Arabic sources. Arabic chroniclers recorded him as a demon from the north. No Norse artifacts have been conclusively identified in the western Mediterranean from this period, making material confirmation elusive. A fringe theory argues the Luna-Rome confusion was a later saga invention designed to mock Bjorn's intelligence, and that his real targets were always the wealthy coastal monasteries. His raids were primarily what scholars call manhunts. prioritizing the capture of young women and children for the slave trade over material plunder. He triggered a collapse of coastal trade across the western Mediterranean, forcing cities to construct new fortifications. He co-led the expedition with Hásteinn, the most deception-oriented commander in Viking history, who provided the strategic planning behind the infiltrations. Bjorn used Mediterranean plunder to purchase the Swedish throne and found the Munso dynasty. He was interred in a massive burial mound on the island of Munso in Lake Mälaren, Sweden, still visible today. Genghis Khan had clear geographical objectives and incorporated conquered peoples into his empire. Bjorn was raiding purely for portable wealth. Despite the enormous plunder gained, the Mediterranean expedition produced no permanent settlement. It was a strategic failure disguised as a tactical success. But while Bjorn operated across a vast geography, the next figure demonstrates that Viking violence could be equally devastating when confined to a few small islands. Number 9. Thorfinn Skull-Splitter. The epithet is not metaphorical. Thorfinn earned it through his documented habit of cleaving helmets and skulls in a single overhead swing of the two-handed Dane axe. He ruled the Orkney Islands, a small archipelago off the northern tip of Scotland, through a system that modern political scientists might recognize as a microstate built on perpetual violence. His succession was decided by fratricide. He conducted constant low-intensity raiding on the Scottish mainland, particularly in Caithness and Sutherland. He maintained power through what can only be described as an assassination culture, proactively murdering any cousin who displayed leadership potential. He married a Scottish noblewoman named Grelad purely to gain a legal claim to the mainland, then functionally ignored her. The mainstream view treats Thorfinn as a historical Earl of Orkney whose brutality was typical of 10th century Norse frontier politics. Viking-era longhouse foundations on Orkney, such as those at the Brug of Bursay, confirm Norse settlement but cannot be tied to Thorfinn individually. The Orkneyinga saga, written centuries later, may have exaggerated his violence to create a compelling origin narrative for the later, more civilized earls. He replaced traditional Norse law with a system based on immediate physical retribution, what some historians have informally called the Law of the Axe. He turned the Orkney fjords into a lawless piracy zone for raiding North Sea shipping. He systematically erased local Pictish culture through forced labor and what the sources describe as thrall breeding programs. He converted ancient Scottish brocks, stone defensive towers, into Viking strongholds. His economic model ran entirely on ransoming captured Gaelic royalty. He provided military muscle for larger Viking campaigns in Ireland, including during the period surrounding the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. He was a master of the two-handed Dane axe, a weapon requiring immense upper body strength and delivering blows that could split a man from shoulder to hip. He was one of the few extremely violent Norse leaders to die of natural causes, likely because he had preemptively killed everyone capable of staging a coup. His reign began the blending of Norse and Gaelic DNA in the Orkney and Shetland Islands. That genetic legacy is still measurable in modern populations. His descendants, the Earls of Orkney, remained the most dangerous family in the North Atlantic for 300 years. Genghis Khan valued the Yasa code of universal law. Thorfinn valued only the axe. And while Thorfinn used brute force, the next figure on this list proved that deception could be even more devastating. Number 10. Hásteinn. Hásteinn may be the most dishonored man in the Viking Age. He was a false flag specialist. He used white flags and religious symbols to lure enemies out of fortified positions, then massacred them. He repeatedly converted to Christianity to gain entry to cities, only to sack them during the baptismal service itself. He provided the strategic brain behind Bjorn Ironside's Mediterranean expedition, planning the deceptions that enabled the Luna infiltration. He controlled the Loire River Valley for approximately 20 years, turning it into a corridor of destruction for Frankish monasteries and towns. He was one of the primary commanders at the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886, which defied the Frankish emperor for nearly a year. The mainstream view holds that Hásteinn was a historical chieftain documented in English, Frankish, and Arabic sources. His Loire Valley island forts, fortified positions built on islands in the middle of rivers, have been identified at several locations. These positions neutralized the Frankish cavalry advantage, since mounted knights could not reach them. A fringe theory argues Hásteinn is a semi-legendary composite figure, merging the deeds of several unrelated raiders into a single trickster archetype. He distributed rumors of his own death to lure defenders into complacency before striking. He targeted the burials of Christian saints specifically to demonstrate that the Christian god was powerless to protect his own dead. He took money from one Frankish lord to burn the lands of another, then robbed the first lord as well. He used hostages as human shields to escape supposedly hopeless sieges. He deployed networks of beggar spies to map the internal layouts of European cities before attacking. He remained a raiding chieftain well into his 70s, an extraordinary anomaly in a profession where life expectancy was brutally short. He led the Great Army of 892, a secondary invasion of England that nearly overwhelmed the defenses built by Alfred the Great. Genghis Khan executed men who lied to him, viewing deception of a lord as a capital crime. Hostein's entire tactical manual was built on lying. He disappeared from the historical record after a final raid on England. No chronicle records his death. The mystery persists. Now, with all 10 figures accounted for, there is a practice attributed to several of them that demands its own examination. It is the most controversial topic in Viking studies: blood eagle, ritual, propaganda, or myth. The procedure, as described in the sagas, goes like this. The victim's ribs were separated from the spine through an incision in the back. The ribs were then bent outward to resemble wings. The lungs were pulled through the opening, where they supposedly fluttered. It appears in multiple saga sources, including the Ragnarssona Thatr and the Orkneyinga saga. It is most famously associated with Ivar the Boneless's execution of King Ella. It was also attributed to Torf Einar's killing of Halfdan Heilig in Orkney. Modern surgeons have debated whether a victim could survive long enough for the lungs to be exposed while still breathing. A 2022 study published in the journal Speculum by Luke John Murphy argued the procedure was anatomically possible, but would require specific sequencing to maintain the victim's consciousness. 3 theories dominate the debate. The mainstream academic position, championed by Roberta Frank in her influential 1984 paper, holds that the blood eagle was entirely fictional, a misreading of conventional battle poetry. Linguistic analysis suggests the Old Norse term blood urn may be a kenning, a poetic metaphor that was later misinterpreted as a literal description. The archaeological and medical counter-argument holds that the procedure is anatomically feasible and consistent with known Norse ritual sacrifice practices at sites like Trelleborg. The fringe revisionist theory proposes that the blood eagle was real but misunderstood, a post-mortem desecration of an already dead enemy, not a torture performed on the living. Supporting evidence exists for ritual violence in Viking culture. Adam of Bremen described a temple at Uppsala where humans and animals were hanged in a sacred grove. Ibn Fadlan's 921 eyewitness account of a Rus Viking ship burial on the Volga includes the ritual killing of a slave girl. Whether or not the blood eagle was literally performed, the rumor of it functioned as powerful psychological warfare. The debate matters because how we interpret this practice shapes our entire understanding of Viking religion, warfare, and the reliability of saga literature. No skeletal evidence has ever been found. But as archaeologists are fond of noting, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That principle applies equally to the economic system that funded all of this violence. The slave economy, the engine behind Viking expansion. Historians estimate that the slave trade was the single most valuable commodity in the Viking economy, exceeding silver, furs, and amber. Every warlord on this list operated within it. Ivar the Boneless built Dublin into the largest slave market in Western Europe by the late 9th century. Bjorn Ironside's Mediterranean raids prioritized capturing people over material plunder. Thorfinn Skull-Splitter reduced the Pictish population of Orkney to thrall status. Freydis' Vinland expedition was partly motivated by the potential for capturing indigenous people. The Volga trade route carried captured Slavic and Baltic peoples down Russian rivers to Bulgar and Khazar markets, and ultimately to Baghdad. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan left an eyewitness account in 921 describing Viking merchants on the Volga selling slaves alongside furs. The word slave itself derives from Slav, reflecting the scale of Eastern European enslavement. The mainstream position treats the thrall trade as a central, organized component of the Viking economy, documented across multiple source traditions. Archaeological evidence supports this. Iron shackles, slave collars, and chain fragments have been found at sites like Dublin's Wood Quay and Birka in Sweden. A revisionist fringe argues that the scale has been exaggerated by later medieval writers who conflated Norse raiding with the larger Mediterranean slave trade. Under Norse law, thralls had no legal personhood. Killing a thrall carried no legal penalty, only a financial one, payable to the owner. Children of thralls were automatically enslaved, creating a self-sustaining captive labor force. Some historians estimate a healthy young male thrall was worth 8 to 12 ounces of silver in 10th century markets, roughly equivalent to 3 or 4 cows. The Domesday Book of 1086 records that approximately 10% of England's population were classified as slaves at the time of the Norman conquest, a legacy partly attributable to Viking-era practices. Modern DNA studies of Icelandic populations reveal significant Celtic and Irish maternal lineage, consistent with the documented abduction of women from the British Isles. 19th and 20th century Scandinavian nationalism romanticized Vikings as explorers and traders, actively downplaying the slave trade. The Dublin excavations at Wood Quay in the 1970s and 80s uncovered physical evidence of slaveholding infrastructure. The Christianization of Scandinavia gradually reduced the trade by prohibiting the enslavement of fellow Christians. But it did not eliminate it. The thrall trade was the hidden engine, and the tools of that engine deserve technical examination: Viking weaponry and the technology of violence. The Ulfberht swords are among the most remarkable artifacts of the Viking Age. Inscribed with the +VLFBERH+T mark, they were high-status Frankish blades that reached Scandinavia through trade despite Carolingian export bans. Ivar the Boneless is associated with these weapons, indicating elite continental connections. Metallurgical analysis reveals that genuine Ulfberhts were made from crucible steel with a carbon content around 1.0 to 1.2%, comparable to modern industrial steel and far superior to typical medieval iron. Approximately 170 Ulfberht swords have been found across Europe, dating from the 9th to 11th centuries. Many are counterfeits identifiable by misspelled inscriptions and inferior metal. The mainstream theory holds that Ulfberht was a Frankish workshop or brand name. An archaeological counter-theory proposes that the high-carbon steel originated from Central Asian or Middle Eastern crucible steel ingots traded along the Volga route. The fringe position argues the technology was independently developed in Scandinavia, pointing to advanced Norse smelting sites. The two-handed Dane axe, Thorfinn Skull-Splitter's weapon of choice, featured a blade width of 20 to 45 centimeters and a haft length of approximately 1.5 meters. It required immense upper body strength and created a decisive reach advantage over sword-armed opponents. Erik Bloodaxe's Huskarl troops relied on its cutting power for decapitation strikes. Viking longship design was the true force multiplier. The shallow draft allowed navigation of rivers and beaches. This was the key to asymmetric mobility. Ivar's portage technique extended operational range into the interior. Harald Hardrada imported Byzantine siege engines. Bjorn Ironside's fleet of 62 ships, each carrying approximately 30 to 60 warriors, represented a force of roughly 2,000 to 3,700 men, operating thousands of miles from home with no supply lines. Svein Forkbeard's Trelleborg forts, with their geometrically perfect ring formations and barracked housing, suggest military engineering previously associated only with Roman armies. The Christianization period eventually shifted elite patronage from weaponsmiths to church builders, and Carolingian trade bans restricted access to high-quality steel. Viking metallurgical knowledge declined. Experimental archaeologists at institutions like the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, have reconstructed longships and tested Ulfberht replicas, confirming the extraordinary quality of Viking-era technology. But every claim in this documentary rests on a foundation that deserves direct scrutiny. The saga problem. How do we know any of this? Most of the events described here occurred in the 9th through 11th centuries. The sagas describing them were written in the 13th century. That is a 200 to 300 year delay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary English source for Viking invasions, was written by monks who were themselves victims of Viking raids. The bias is obvious. The Icelandic sagas are literary masterpieces, but they were written in a Christianized Iceland that had incentives to portray the pagan past as both heroic and horrifying. Snorri Sturluson, who lived from 1179 to 1241, is the most important saga author. He wrote Egil's Saga and the Heimskringla. He was also a politician whose work served contemporary political purposes. Arabic sources, Ibn Fadlan, and other Islamic writers provide independent eyewitness accounts of Viking behavior that are invaluable precisely because they had no Christian agenda. The mainstream position holds that sagas contain a core of historical truth heavily embellished with literary invention. Archaeological evidence increasingly confirms saga accounts. The Repton grave, the Lonso Meadows site, and the Dublin excavations all suggest more historical basis than scholars once assumed. Fringe literary theory treats sagas as primarily fiction, medieval novels rather than historical documents. The oral tradition bridge matters here. Skaldic poetry was composed contemporaneously and memorized with precision. Some of Egill's verses are linguistically dated to the 10th century, suggesting genuine preservation even within a 13th century saga framework. The Lonso Meadows excavation by Helger and Anstein Ingstad in 1960 proved the Vinland sagas described real voyages, vindicating a source tradition previously dismissed as fantasy. Eric Bloodaxe's York minted coins are the only material proof of his reign. Roberta Frank's 1984 paper demonstrated how a simple battle metaphor could be misread and elaborated into a ritual over successive retellings. Frankish chronicles provide a hostile but contemporary perspective on Halstein and Bjorn that often corroborates saga accounts from a completely different cultural angle. Modern DNA studies confirm patterns of Norse settlement described in the sagas. The Skaldic poetry database is using computational linguistics to date individual verses, potentially separating genuine 10th century composition from later additions. The fundamental paradox is this: every claim in this documentary is filtered through sources that are biased, incomplete, or written centuries after the fact. Yet the convergence of Norse, English, Frankish, Arabic, and archaeological evidence creates a picture that, while imperfect, is substantially credible. The Reformation destroyed many Icelandic manuscripts. What survives represents an unknown fraction of a much larger literary tradition. 10 individuals, each documented in ways that challenge the popular image of Vikings as rugged explorers and skilled traders. The comparison that frames this documentary, Genghis Khan, is instructive. Genghis built infrastructure, law codes, and religious tolerance alongside his conquests. Several of the figures examined here offered destruction without construction. The spectrum is wide. Ivar's strategic terror, Egill's personal sadism, Svein's bureaucratic extraction. Viking warfare was not monolithic, but beneath every raid, every kingdom, and every saga, one thread persists: the commodification of human beings. The slave trade drove the Viking economy. Everything we know is filtered through hostile or distant writers. The truth lies somewhere between saga heroics and archaeological silence. What survived is measurable: the Danelaw, the Dublin foundations, the Orkney genetic legacy, the Icelandic language, the place names of northern England. What was lost is harder to quantify: the perspectives of the victims, the thralls, the burned monks, the populations of the hinterland strategy who have no saga. The Viking Age closed at Stamford Bridge in 1066, 3 weeks before the world changed at Hastings. The Vikings applied the same ingenuity to war, the longship, the portage, the firebird, that other civilizations applied to architecture and agriculture. Human societies have always used the laws of nature, wind, water, fire, steel, and human endurance to build and to destroy. The Viking Age is one of history's most vivid demonstrations of that duality. New archaeological discoveries, DNA studies, and computational analysis of saga texts continue to revise the picture. Modern popular culture, television, games, tourism tends to sanitize this history. The names persist: Ivar, Eric, Olaf, Freydis, Egill, Harald, Svein, Bjorn, Thorfinn, Halstein. Each represents a different face of an era defined by violence. The forces that shaped that era, ambition, greed, faith, fear, and the technology to act on all of them, have never disappeared.